Hey everybody, this is Dr. Rebecca Oliver and welcome to my video on the whys and hows of significant figures. And by the end of this short video, you're going to be able to tell me why, even though 15,000 has 5 numbers, only 2 are significant. So, let's get started. What are significant figures all about? Well, they tell us a couple of things. And one of the things that significant figures tell us is about how detailed our data is. That is, if we've gone through the trouble to measure something, just how much trouble did we go through? The other thing significant figures tell us is about how precise or how much precision the instrument used to take the measurement has. So for example, let's say that we wanted to measure the long side of our square, and we had a ruler that was marked with 1-inch intervals. Well, we know that the square is at least 2 inches long because it passes the 2-inch mark. So we could say that one of the significant digits is the 2 of our 2 inches. But we have this additional part of the square extending beyond the 2-inch mark. What about that? Well, our ruler doesn't give us any markings for guidance, but we need to account for this additional length. So what are we going to do? Well, we have to guess. We have to make an estimate. And I'll estimate that this square is a little more than halfway between 2 inches and 3 inches, so I'll say that it's coming in at about 0.6. So my final measured value is 2.6 inches. One number that I know for certain, which is the 2, and the other number I estimated, which is the 6. And each of these numbers is important, so 2.6 has 2 significant figures. What if I had a ruler that was a bit more detailed, like this one? Well, this one has additional marks at the half-inch point. So if we look at the box now, we know that not only does it measure to the 2-inch mark, but it also measures to the half beyond the 2. So in this scenario, we know that we have 2.5 inches, but the box extends beyond the 2.5-inch mark. So what are we going to do? Well, just like last time, we're going to guess. We have to make an estimate. And now I'm going to say that this extra little bit is going to fall somewhere between 0.5 inches and 0.6 inches. So I'm going to add an additional 5 to my number, making my final measurement, my final measured value, 2.55 inches, which is 3 significant figures. So now you can see that when you have a measuring device that gives you a little bit more detail, your data is going to have more detail as well, and you'll end up with more significant figures as a result. So now that we have an understanding why numbers can be significant, how do we determine which numbers are significant just by looking at a number? Well, that's what we're exploring next. If you go into a textbook or go online and look up the rules for determining significant figures, most authors are going to give you about 6 or 7 rules in order to determine which numbers are important as far as determining significant figures. I've taken those rules and I've distilled it down into 3 easy rules that'll get you through most scenarios for needing to determine significant figures. And we're going to take a look at those rules and then we're going to use them with some examples so we can see how these rules work. So what are these 3 easy rules? Well, rule number 1 says that leading zeros never count. Rule number 2 says that trailing zeros count only when there's a decimal present in the number. And rule number 3 says anything other than a leading zero or a trailing zero counts. So these are the rules. Now let's learn how to apply them. Starting with rule number 1, leading zeros never count. Now what this means is that whenever a number has 1 or more zeros to the left, which is where we start reading a number, to the left, those zeros will never count as significant figures. So let's look at an example. So here we have 00825. And rule number 1 says that these first 2 zeros are not going to count towards significant digits, which means that even though we have 5 numbers here, the first 2 don't count because they're leading zeros, which means that the 8, the 2, and the 5 are going to be significant, and that 00825 has 3 significant figures. Let's look at another example. 007. And what does rule number 1 say? Rule number 1 says that leading zeros never count. So we're going to get rid of these first two zeros, and we're going to see that the only number that's left is the 7, and that 007 has one significant figure. So here's a couple of examples on how to apply rule number 1. Let's take a look at rule number 2. Trailing zeros count only when there's a decimal present in the number. Now this rule deals with zeros that occur on the right of the number at the end. And this rule means that if the number we're considering has a decimal anywhere in that number, then those zeros to the right are included in our count of significant figures. If there's no decimal, then they don't count. So let's take a look at an example. Here we have 217.0. Now first off, we see that there is a 0 on the right, a 0 at the end. And what else do we see? We see a decimal, that's right. And because of that decimal, this trailing 0 is going to be counted towards significant figures. So the 2, the 1, the 7, and that 0 are all going to be significant, which means 217.0 has 4 significant figures. So what about this number? 2,170. Well, it too has a trailing 0, but what else do we see? Or rather, what do we not see? Well, we don't see a decimal. So because there is no decimal, this trailing 0 does not count towards our significant figures, which means that it's the 2, the 1, and the 7 that are significant, and that 2,170 has 3 significant figures. And that's how you apply rule number 2. And now we're at rule number 3. Anything other than a leading 0 or a trailing 0 counts. So let's look at some examples on how to apply rule number 3. So here we have a number 1001. Do we have any zeros at the beginning? Nope. Do we have any zeros at the end? Nope. Which means that by applying rule number 3, all 4 of these numbers, the 1 at the beginning, the 2 zeros in the middle, and the 1 at the end, are all important, and we have 4 significant figures in our first example. What about this number? 0.1001. We've changed it up a little bit. And what do we see? Do we have any leading zeros? Yep. What do we do with leading zeros? We don't count them. Leading zeros never count. That's rule number 1. Do we have any zeros at the end? Nope, so we don't have to worry about those trailing zeros, which means we don't have to worry about the decimal that's in our number. And that leaves us with rule number 3. Anything other than leading zeros or trailing zeros count. So that means that we have a 1, a couple of zeros in the middle, and a 1 at the end, and this number also has 4 significant figures. And let's look at one more example. Here we have 0.010010. Here we have it all going on. Do we have leading zeros? Indeed we do. We have 2. And rule number 1 helps us deal with those. And rule number 1 says leading zeros never count. So we're not going to worry about those leading zeros counting towards significant figures. Rule number 2 helps us deal with the zeros that occur at the end of a number. And that says that if we have trailing zeros, they're only going to count if there's a decimal present. And do we have a decimal in this number? Indeed we do. It's all the way over to the left, but because it's there, no matter where it is, that means that that little 0 to the right is going to be important when we count significant figures. So all these numbers at this point that are not crossed through are going to be important. So the 1, these 2 zeros in the middle, this second 1, and this last 0 are all significant figures, and we have 5 significant figures in 0.010010. And that's how you apply rule number 3. So now we have mastered Dr. O's 3 easy rules for determining significant figures. And here we are again at the introductory slide. And like I said, now you're going to be able to explain what the significant figures are for 15,000. And what do we see with this number? We see trailing zeros. What rule deals with zeros at the right of the number? That's rule number 2. And what does rule number 2 say? Rule number 2 says trailing zeros count only when a decimal is present. And this number has no decimal, which means all 3 of those zeros don't count, and 15,000 has only 2 significant figures. Good job, everybody, and thanks for watching.